and maybe this is a little bit more conservative. Maybe this is just me thinking of the chaos that is the tournament. I think Gonzaga, I could think Gonzaga reaches the Elite Eight, and that is where the run ends. Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. I'm Zach Farmer. It's great having you back as I'm set to do the third of my preseason team wrap-ups, team previews. And as we start to go through this, we've already talked about majority of the conference schools and everything else. And this week we'll go into the last of this last segment of WCC teams, Portland, Gonzaga, and then also Pacific. And I'll also get into some players I think are going to have an opportunity to be breakout stars this season, and we'll get into that in a bit. So if you've missed it and haven't seen some of the episodes, I've already kind of done the previews for others. Like 2 weeks ago, we did St. Mary's, Santa Clara, LMU, and Pepperdine. Last week was BYU, USF, and I keep blanking on. He's like San Diego, BYU, USF, and this week will be Gonzaga, Portland, and Pacific. So if you haven't checked out those episodes, please, I encourage you to go back, listen to those when you have time, and then also then come back if you do that, and then listen to what I end up talking about: Gonzaga, Portland, and Pacific. All right, so we'll start right there, and we're going to dive into the shocker of last year, the surprise team of a year ago, Portland. This was a team last year that went 19-15. They finished 6th in the WCC. And you can't talk about this team without the context of what they had been just 2 seasons ago. This was a program that was, and there's no way around this, they were awful. They won all of 3 conference games the last 3 seasons before this past one. This was a team that just seemed to get worse and worse and worse under Terry Porter. And this team needed a huge facelift. This team needed to find a new identity, to really kind of like get out of the dreg where they had been the past 4 or 5 seasons. And then they brought in Shante Legans to be the new head coach. He immediately brought in a slew of guys that he had at Eastern Washington, where he had just reached the NCAA tournament with the Eagles. And in the preseason, it started to look, there was some promise. Like they're starting to put it together. They were starting to look, there were a lot of early growing pains because, again, you had a lot of new pieces on this team. I believe it was like 11, 12 new players were on the roster. So new head coach, new roster, new team, everything was new at Portland last year. And then they got hit with COVID right around the new year, going into the first week of conference play. And that kind of derailed some of that momentum, slowed them down a bit. And then once they came out of it, once they started to really put pieces together, and it all started to come together late in conference play. This was a team that was still right down there, like at the 8-9 spot, and then finished up the conference play they went 6-1 down the stretch in WCC play. They have a huge win over USF, kind of like it was the shocker of the WCC schedule. I feel, again, this is a Portland team that for years and years had been at the very bottom of the league, and they were almost an automatic W you could put on your schedule. And last year, that was no longer the case. Last year, Portland became a team you had to pay attention to. Portland became a team that you knew was going to only get better. And this year, we're kind of looking at that. And I think a number of components kind of go into this year. They were sixth last year, so still bottom half of the league. And they finished only a half a game out of fifth. So there's a lot of optimism, a lot of talk about moving even further up the ranks here in the WCC, which I think Portland has the capability of doing. But one of the things also to keep in mind is now there are expectations. Now no one will be overlooking Portland going into the season, where they might have at the beginning of last year. And a lot of the reasons for that optimism, a lot of the reasons for why they think, despite the fact that there that there's going to be more expectations, that there's not going to be this lull, or there's not going to be this overlooking of Portland anymore. They bring almost everyone back, and that's a huge lift for this team. You bring back guys like Mike Meadows, Tyler Robertson, you bring back Moses Wood, you bring back Christian Ciolin. Once he returns from injury, you'll be bringing back Chris Austin. You have a lot of pieces on this squad who are going to be back and really be able to help this team kind of take that next step in the WCC. I'm talking about that trio of Meadows, Robertson, and Wood, who will be starting the season off. These three, the scoring jolt for the Pilots, and we saw it last year, could come from anywhere. It could come from Mike Meadows. It could come from Moses Wood, who had a great run down the stretch. It could come from Tyler Robertson, who recorded the WCC's first triple double in a long time. I believe that was Kyle Collinsworth, who was the last one to record a triple double. And then they bring in some key pieces where some of the challenges that Portland had a year ago was they weren't very big. They weren't a tall team. They weren't a big team. And so they went out, and so Santiago Liggins went out and looked to try to remedy some of that in the offseason. And the one that everyone's been pointing to this offseason, a big component of what we're going to see from Portland, is Joey St. Pierre. The Milwaukee transfers coming in, and he's going to be able to kind of provide that big body in the middle. 6.3 points per game last year, 5.7 rebounds. It's a large body that's going to be able to help them on the defensive end, especially because this is where like Portland really struggled. They struggled with the size of some of the other WCC teams, like the St. Mary's, the Gonzagas, the Santa Claras. Like these were big teams who could really punish you inside. And so this was an area where Portland we knew could improve. And then the other one was really just depth. This was a team that really only was playing about 7 players in rotation last season, just because of how new the system was. And there was really just an emphasis on running with the guys that could be more consistent more quickly. So another one of the guys who's coming in who is going to be able to provide some punch off the bench is Vukasin Masic, who's coming in from Maine. 6'5" guard, 9.3 points, four rebounds a game, 85% free throw shooter. This is something Portland did really well last year, was get to the line, and they were the best free throw shooting team in the league. And that really helps when you also then have your top 7 scorers coming back. Portland is an exciting team. Portland is a team I think that's going to be right there in the mix with all of these teams, as we've kind of talked about over the last month or so. 3 through 9 in this conference is really up for grabs. There is no consensus, it seems, where any of these teams are going to finish because they are so close. Between BYU, USF, Santa Clara, Portland, Pepperdine, San Diego, even LMU, I think is going to get back into this conversation. And any one of these teams could end up finishing in any one of those spots. And Portland is going to be amongst that list. And they're going to be tested early in the non-conference. Now, I will say, like, their non-conference isn't like, it doesn't scream wow on the overall spectrum, on the overall scope of it, but one tournament is going to tell us a lot about Portland, I think, early on, and that is the PK 85. Portland will be playing in the PK 85, the Phil Knight Invitational, in mid-November, and they started off they started off with who many believe is maybe the best team in the country, is the preseason number one overall, North Carolina. Uh, so we're going to see what Portland can do right away. Obviously, I don't think anyone's expecting Portland to win that game, but it's going to provide them probably great opportunity, great exposure to kind of see what they're capable of doing. This is a confident group, this Portland group. And at media day, Tyler Robertson and all the Portland players have kind of said this, and that they're not satisfied, that they are focused on continuing to improve, because while in the grand scope of things, the improvement from 10th to 6th is a great accomplishment for Portland. A lot of those guys are coming from programs where they're used to being first. And so they kind of took the Ricky Bobby mantra of, like, if you're not first, you're last. And so this is a confident group. They are a driven group. I think we're going to learn a lot about them in that North Carolina game. Even if they don't win, I think it's going to be focused on their competitiveness, whether you start to see their heads go down, if they're able to kind of bounce back when Carolina could go on runs or whatnot. How can they really kind of like manage the environment that they're going to see at the Rose Garden against Carolina? And also on that side of the bracket, they're going to get either Iowa State or Villanova. Again, in either case, this is going to be a great experience for Portland, going into the rest of their non-conference and then also into WCC play. On the other side of the bracket, again, depending on how all this shakes out, the other half of the bracket is UConn, Oregon, Alabama, and Michigan State. So Portland will end up playing one of those teams at some point during that tournament, during that Thanksgiving Day weekend. So it'll be exciting to see. And again, this is going to be a huge test for Portland, a huge test to see kind of where are they now. We saw where they were a year ago, nearly a 20-win team after being so bad the year before and the years before. And it's can this team build off of what it did a year ago? I'm confident that this team will be able to build off of what they did a year ago. And they're going to at least get some games and be tested at least early on. They do have a couple of road games the week before they start the Phil Knight Invitational. They'll be at Kent State, they'll be at Air Force, and later on they will end up playing Oregon. So theoretically they could end up playing Oregon twice in the preseason, because they are on the other side of the bracket in the PK Invitational, but they're going to be in Eugene on December 17th. And that will be just 1 week before the start of conference play as we start to get ready. And they started off with LMU. And here's the other thing for Portland as far as the schedule goes. Portland did finish in 6th. Portland was 7-7 at the end of the season. Because Portland was in last, keep in mind the way the schedule breaks out in the WCC is that there are certain teams you only play once. Portland only played Gonzaga once and only played BYU once, which means that they will see both of them twice this coming season. And this is going to be one of the they only play BYU. They're only going to play BYU once. They will say St. Mary's twice this season. And that's going to be a big change for how they navigate this non-conference. And even looking at the first wave, the first couple of weeks of conference play, this is going to be a huge opportunity for Portland to see if they can bounce back, because week one of WCC play, they're at BYU. Week two, they have both St. Mary's and San Francisco, and then week three they're at Gonzaga. They are going to get tested, and they may get beat up early. How they are able to manage that and weather the storm that is going to be those first few weeks is also going to be a telling sign for the rest of conference play as we get deeper into January, February, and then into March. Okay, so now where do I think where do they fall? Where is Portland going to be? Portland, I think, has a higher range than most of the other teams in this mid-tier window. I think Portland's ceiling is probably in the third spot, and their floor is probably right where they were this past year at six. Where do I think Portland will end up? I think Portland is probably destined for, my prediction would be fourth place. I think that is where they will be. They were just a half game behind BYU a year ago. I think Portland's now better than they were a year ago. I think Santa Clara is going to take a step back. I I'm not a huge step back, but I do think that they are going to take a step back. Obviously, when you lose a guy like Jalen Williams, that's going to have an impact. You don't have another NBA guy on that roster. And then taking a look at USF, who I still think is actually in that third slot. I think USF for now is like that would be where I have them. But Portland's right behind them. Again, these two met head to head last year twice, and they split between the two matchups. USF is not has I think more to prove on the interior this year than they did a year ago. And again, Portland brings back its top seven scorers. I think they're going to be a little deeper than a year ago. They've added some size, so we'll see how this all goes. But I think that's Portland is probably sitting in that fourth slot when we reach Vegas, which also means they will have one of the buys, one of the double buys for the NCAA for the WCC tournament. Okay, so now we'll transition over to Pacific. Pacific, this is a team that also has been in this huge transition year last year. This is going into a year where Damon Stoudemire got an offer he could not refuse, and took an assistant job with the Boston Celtics. Obviously, the Celtics ended up in the NBA Finals. They look to still be one of the better teams in the NBA this year, potentially getting back there. It was a chance and an opportunity. Obviously, like Damon Stoudemire could not pass up. And he was, I thought, pretty successful at Pacific in those 5 years. Now go into last season, the first year under Leonard Perry. The way last off season just went would have been tough to manage for anyone. It's new head coach. You had a lot of players look to go elsewhere. So this was kind of like a really hodgepodge sort of roster that really was trying to find an identity after Stoudemire left. Now, Leonard Perry was on the staff, so there was some sort of continuity there, but there was going to be some change. There was going to be some turnover. Also, they lost a few of the guys who really were key pieces for them the year before. So there was no surprise when Pacific struggled a year ago. They went 7-22. They were ninth in the WCC. But one of the things yes, there were 22 losses, but they almost stole one at USC in the non-conference. It was almost one of those games, I think, from my own point of view. Like when I saw Pacific at USC, I was like, oh, USC will just like kick their teeth in. They were in that game up until the very end. They were in that game with 4 minutes left to go. Pacific still had a lead. it looked like Pacific might have been able to pull that off. Unfortunately, they didn't, but it did show that that Pacific might still have something there. That Pacific could be growing to something. Now we go into this year. 6 returners, 8 newcomers. You do have 3 of your top 6 returning. Luke Avdalovich comes back. You have Nick Blake come back, and then also Greg Outlaw, who missed a lot of last year with an injury. And Outlaw, I think, is one of the key components. Last year, he only averaged 5.8 per game last year, but this is a guy who was maybe one of the better shooters overall at 45% from the field. This is a team that did not. This was an offensively challenged team a year ago. They were 9th in points per game. They were 10th in field goal percentage. They were 10th in 3-point percentage. They were 9th in rebounding, 9th in rebounding margin. And then the defense wasn't all that great either. They were 8th in opponents' points per game. They were 10th in opponents' 3-point percentage. They were 10th in free throws. This is a team that was not, they were just not good a year ago overall. And it didn't seem to matter who the opponent was, that they struggled night in, night out. And yes, they were banged up. Yes, there were a lot of new pieces. So going into this year, offense, rebounding, and 3-point D has to be the focus, which is why the likes of having Greg Outlaw come back is such a huge deal. Having him be healthy, having him be ready to go is going to be a big lift for Pacific. One of the transfers coming in who I think is going to be really key for them is Jordan Ivy Curry, 6'2" guard out of UT San Antonio. He averaged 13.9 a game last year. So this is someone who's going to be able to give them consistent points and hopefully be able to kind of like lift this Pacific offense out of kind of the drag of where they had been. But I will say, like, the one thing that made Pacific really competitive just a few years ago wasn't necessarily the offense. It was their defense. When Pacific seemed to be humming, when Pacific seemed to be going well, their identity was this rough, tough defensive team. And that's what made going to Stockton, going to the Spanos Center so challenging, was that you knew you were in for a fight when you played Pacific just a few years ago. And that's where it seemed like they need to kind of get back to that identity. One of the other guys coming in could potentially help on this. They bring in a couple of different players from Oklahoma State, Kalen Boone and Donovan Williams. Donovan Williams, 6'5" guard, Kalen Boone, 6'8" forward. To have some versatile pieces that are going to be able to play multiple positions for Pacific this season, and that should really help their defense. Tyler Beard coming in from Georgetown, another 6'2" guard. He's a guy who would also put up some points for this team in this one season at Georgetown. He only got about 12 minutes per game, but he also had season highs of 23 at Howard. He also had a 15-point game against Butler. Now, yeah, that was not a very good Butler team a year ago, and this was a really bad Georgetown team a year ago. But there's space for Pacific to hopefully kind of climb out of this cellar, and they'll also have some early opportunities to kind of see what they can do. They'll be at Stanford on November 7th. That will be, I think it's the very first game of the college basketball season. So at Stanford, 11 in the morning, which is still so odd to me. It's like, you gotta have an 11 a.m. game. Okay. On a Monday. I don't know how many people are going to be in attendance for that thing, but it's going to be a really good test for them. They also later will have Santa Barbara, and then also a very good Fresno State team who's going to be heading up to Stockton for that one. And I'd be remiss, like, let me go back and talk a little bit more about Nick Blake, who I think is is also going to be one of the keys for this team. This is Blake's going to one of those guys who's going to attack the basket. He started 11 games a year ago, played in 28. He was averaging just under 9 points a game and had 20-point games against BYU and Pepperdine. He was in double figures 12 times a year ago. He had 16 free throw attempts in that Pepperdine game. So Blake is someone who's going to be able to kind of slow the pace down because of how often he's going to get to the free throw line. And again, I think slowing teams down, limiting possessions, and playing that tough defense is going to be what suits Pacific best this season. Now, all that said, all my trying to be optimistic about what Pacific could do, I don't see the improvements with Pacific that I have seen with the other teams. I don't see I don't see the offensive weapons that are going to be consistent enough to help Pacific climb out the gutter, to help them climb out of that bottom tier. So my when I'm thinking about where Pacific could end up at the end of the season, where they're going to end up for Vegas, I don't think they changed much from where they were a year ago. They were ninth last year. I think that's their ceiling this year, but realistically, I this is the last place team. Pacific is just does not have the talent. They don't, and they have so many holes to fix that I don't know that we're going to see that drastic of a change in this season. I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think that this is a team that is probably in probably a 2-3 year rebuild window to try to get back to try to find their identity and really get back to where they were just a few years ago. Okay, so now that we've talked about Portland, now that we've talked about Pacific, I think we have to talk about the the team that everyone continues to talk about, not only on whatever slew of other of WCC podcasts or content, but everyone across the nation. One of the teams who was on that short list to win a national championship, the team with the best odds in Vegas to win a national championship, that being the Gonzaga Bulldogs. I don't think that you can talk about Gonzaga without talking about their immense expectations. Because this is a team that has done it all now, with the exception of one thing, and that's win a championship. They've been to a title game twice in the last 5 seasons. They've been to the Final Four multiple times. They've been to the Sweet 16. It's now I think 7 straight tournaments, I should say. They've had they've had top picks. They've had 5-star recruits. They right now have maybe the best college basketball player in the nation and will probably be one of the guys we talk about for years to come in Drew Timme. This is a team that has recruited. It seems like that every time you think like, oh, Gonzaga is going to take a step back, they retool and find guys who are going to be even better than the year before. You look at this roster this year, with including the pieces that are coming back, despite losing a talent like Chet Holmgren, they might be better than a year ago or better suited for the NCAA tournament than a year ago. And this Gonzaga team has they can go 9, 10 deep. This is a team that is going to have enough weapons. They are going to have enough weapons this season to, I think, really match up with most any team that you can throw out there. So yes, they lose Andrew Nebhart. They lose Chet Holmgren. And right around the time of the NBA draft, or right as players had to make their final decision on if they were coming back or not, we had guys. We had guys like Julian Strother say he was going to return. Huge lift for Gonzaga, but it was about what I expected. I expected Strother to come back. Rasheer Bolton returns again. Another guy, not terribly surprised that he's making his return. The biggest question that everyone had was Drew Timme. Would Drew Timme return to Gonzaga for another season? I say final season because technically he could also come back next season if he really wanted to. And with the rule changes on the NIL and all of that, as we saw in the 11th hour, Drew Timme made his decision to return to Gonzaga, which means that Gonzaga remains one of the deepest, most dangerous teams in college basketball. And because there's very little that you can point to that might be wrong with this roster. If anything, if anything, like the only thing that maybe it's like, oh, maybe they don't block shots all that well because they don't have a Chet Holmgren. Fine, whatever. That's one thing. But this team now is continues to be loaded with shooters. They added shooters, by the way. This is a team that still is one of the better, most efficient offensive teams in the country. Their backcourt is now going to consist of two of the better defenders on the perimeter on the West Coast, if not in the nation, in both Nolan Hickman and Hunter Salas. Strother and Bolton are both incredible shooters. Strother, I think, is going to have an even better year than a year ago, where he was kind of like the breakout star of the WCC, one of the breakout stars. Probably you're going to get that Jalen Williams, but um, Strother, Strother, I think is going to just make another developmental step this season. He's going to be even better than a year ago. Rasheer Bolton is going to be asked to carry a little bit more of the load, a little bit more of the leadership responsibility. This team still has Anton Watson, who is your lunch pail. Just tell him what to do, and he'll go and do it. You need they every team needs a guy like Anton Watson who's just going to be that guy to be a to 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 really get down and dirty and like do all the little things right to help you win. And the two big additions. So Efton Reed, one of the additions, the transfer from LSU. This is your I need to plug the middle addition. So Efton Reed, center out of LSU, he's going to be someone who gives them a little bit more depth down low. He's going to be he. Let's see, looking at his numbers. So he averaged a little less than a block a game. He did start 19 games a year ago. Someone with 6 points, 4 rebounds. So this is going to be a good addition for that Gonzaga front line. Who I think if you're looking at an area that's like, well, maybe they're a little on the thin side defensively there between Watson, Timme, and Reed should help to kind of fill that gap a little bit more. But the one I think that is the biggest addition, and it's funny because it seems like everybody has forgotten this transfer happened, and that's Malachi Smith. Malachi Smith, I again like how is everyone like looking at all these lists that say like, oh, who are the best transfers and what's going to be their biggest impact, blah blah blah. Malachi Smith was the SoCon player, the Southern Conference Player of the Year last year. He averaged 20 points a game, and everyone has forgotten about him, it seems. And I don't know if that's because he's going to be he's a piece rather than a key component for Gonzaga, or that because it's Gonzaga that it's being somehow it's it's being lessened. I don't understand how the adding Malachi Smith, while initially like everyone was like, "Whoa, wow, Malachi Smith's going to Gonzaga." In the months since, it's been like everyone has kind of forgotten. At least anyone outside of Spokane has forgotten. This is a guy who dropped 36 on Murray State. This is a guy who not only is going to give you points like this, he averaged six, almost 7 rebounds last year. He averaged almost 9 rebounds the year before. He's one of the more explosive scorers that was in the portal. He goes to Gonzaga. He could end up in the starting lineup, but he's likely going to be coming off the bench. You have a 20-point scorer, a legit collegiate 20-point scorer who'll be coming off the bench for this team. I that is the crazy one to me. Like I do not understand how that's been so glossed over. So one of the so one of the things that I'm looking at as far as Gonzaga, because I think there are so many different storylines you can kind of go into with this team. I'm wondering when we get to March, when they play some of these really high powered teams in the non conference, who how are the rotations going to look? Because you have a lot of combinations you can use. And I'm thinking because like they have so many guards, like I could right now, like I'm just taking a look at their roster. Like I could run Nolan Hickman, Malachi Smith, Rasheer Bolton, Julian Strother, and Timmy. I could switch Timmy with Watson. I could switch Watson with Reed. I could I could go a little bigger. I could go a little smaller. Do I put Strother at the 4? Do I put Strother at the 3? Between Hickman, Salas, Bolton, and Smith, what's that rotation going to look like? What does it look like once Dominic Harris kind of re-enters the equation as he starts to get healthy? Are we how much of Braden Huff are we going to see this season? We Based on how deep this team is, like there are definitely question marks about that, but this is a team that has so many different weapons, so many options that it feels like you need to take advantage of the fact that you have all these options and utilize them all. And I don't know like if that's realistic, if that's what makes the most sense. I don't know. What I do know, and as I've had some conversations uh, with others about this, that Mark Few, very much like a Randy Bennett, has usually has like a 6-8 person rotation at most, especially by the time we get to like late February and March. They found their rotation. Those are their guys. Even if there are obviously other guys on the roster who could potentially help, they kind of like lock down to what that roster is and that rotation is. You don't see a whole lot of 9-10 man rotations by the time we get to later parts of the season. And I think that would be the one area where it's like there's opportunity to kind of see, at least especially early on, what some of these combinations look like, who works together, who doesn't work together. Because it almost looks like you have like almost a defensive lineup and an offensive lineup. Because if I say like I'm gonna go defense first, like I can go Hickman, Salas, I'm gonna go Brashear, Bolton, Strother, and Watson. If I'm going defense, like I might go there. Or then if I want to go a little, if I need to go bigger, I'll I'll slide up Strother, probably Hickman and Salas stay, Watson, and then Efton Reed. I know I keep leaving Drew Timmy out of that equation because I'm thinking defense. Like Timmy is a great offensive player. If I do need more defense, I'm probably going to turn to Watson or Reed. Like that's just the way I'm thinking about it. And earlier in the offseason, I even talked about the idea. It was like, is this the if this team can run and this team can be that high octane offense where it's going to just run and gun a lot of the times. I don't know if Drew Timmy's the best fit for that style, but we know that Drew Timmy is going to be a key component to this offense. We know that that's not a question. It's just me kind of like spitballing of like this kind of makes more sense to me of like the way the rest of the roster is constructed. That it be a little bit more geared to players who are going to be able to run up and down the floor because Drew Timmy doesn't necessarily like I don't think of Drew Timmy in that way. Drew Timmy's a great half court player. He's a great post player. He's a great mid range shooter. We know he's been working on the 3-point game, which obviously is like that next component that you need for for professional sports, especially at his size. Like you need to be like that stretch four, whatnot. So, so there's so many possibilities for this team, and it's going to be exciting to see them get going because this is going to be maybe one of the more talented offensive teams in the entire run. And taking a look at their schedule, this is a schedule again, like they never Gonzaga never leaves much to the imagination when it comes to that. It's like it's gonna be rough, it's gonna be tough, and there's not a whole lot of a break in here. So again, the first week of the season they're gonna have Michigan State, then they go. Then the following week they have Texas, Kentucky. The following week they do the PK 85. The following week they have Baylor. Then the following week they have kind of at least a little bit of a reprieve, like Kent State and Washington. But then they go right back into it. They're going to have Alabama, and then the last week, the Christmas week, they do have at least a little bit of kind of like they can breathe a little bit, like the Montanas and the Eastern Oregons, before we start conference play. And I don't. I think early on, as good as they have been over the years, like I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that, like, hey, let's take a look at Gonzaga's schedule. It's like, oh, Michigan State, Texas, Kentucky. You have the three games in the PK 85. You have Baylor. You have Alabama. And of those eight, like if they come out of here with three losses, I don't think that's the end of the world. I don't think that changes much of anything for for an NCAA tournament bid. I don't think that changes much of anything in the perception of what Gonzaga is, because a lot of the teams that are going to see are are also top 15 teams. Like a lot of these are all tournament teams. They're all top 25 teams. There there's no there's no shame in losing those games. Like there's no again like there's also no like impact for losing these games in November, December, because Gonzaga is going to still win their fair share of these. I think they can come out of that 8 game stretch. If they're 5-3, 6-2, I think that those are reasonable. If somehow they come out of all of that and they're 8-0, like, oh my God, like this is that would that's going to immediately tell you this is the team that could do it. This is the team that could finally win a national championship. And just thinking about this team, just thinking about us, because like once you get into March, it's matchups. It's anything can happen in the tournament, and just the slightest change could impact the whole thing. So, on a prediction on Gonzaga, where I think Gonzaga is going to end up, I'm not going to do like I do with the rest of the conference teams, where I'm picking where they are in the conference. Gonzaga is going to win the conference. Period. That's that's done. That's a wrap. They might lose one. I think they could drop one game, and it'll be either St. Mary's or BYU. I think more likely St. Mary's. And then for March, I'm just going to go ahead and pencil in at least the floor is Sweet 16. That's kind of a given for this squad, that they at the very least will be there. And then of course I think the the ceiling is they finally win it all. They finally win a national championship. The Gonzaga finally checks off the last box of everything that they've accomplished over the last 20 years. And is that is the peak of what Gonzaga could do this year. What do I think Gonzaga is going to do? And maybe this is a little bit more conservative. Maybe this is just me thinking of the chaos that is the tournament. I think Gonzaga I could think Gonzaga reaches the Elite Eight, and that is where the run ends. That does not mean I don't think that they're still one of the best five teams in the country. That doesn't mean that at all. Gonzaga absolutely is still going to be one of the best five teams in the country. The way they run their offense, the way they play defense, the roster they've constructed, they are one of the best teams. But crazy things happen in the tournament. Crazy things end up shaking out one way or the other. And there are a lot of really tough defensive teams that are also in this conversation. The Houstons, the Carolinas, the Baylors. Like there's a lot of teams who are still in this conversation for who can win it all. I think that somehow the Elite Eight is probably where it will end for Gonzaga this year. I I think again, I think they are more than capable of winning the whole thing, but where I think they're going to end up is just one game short of returning to the Final Four. All right. So now, as we kind of get, we're only a couple weeks before the season begins. So here, I wanted to kind of take a look at, I was looking at all the rosters as I've kind of gone through each of them. And I was like, all right, who could be some of those breakout stars that we see this season? Who are some of the guys who could be really key contributors and bigger contributors than we've seen in the past that are going to have the quote breakout season? And I came up with three names that really stood out, and then a couple more that were like maybes. So, so I'm going to start. I'll start with Gonzaga, and I'll start with Nolan Hickman. Nolan Hickman is going to be taking on a lot more responsibility this season. He's stepping in for Andrew Nemhard. He's stepping in to be a much larger contributor for this Gonzaga team. He's going to be that primary ball handler. He's also a really good defender. I think this kind of combination of what he can do offensively and then what we know he's capable of defensively is going to have Nolan Hickman really start to open some eyes. I think he is. That doesn't mean I think he's going to be like, oh, he's going to average 15 points a game, blah, blah, blah. It's like that Gonzaga team, I think, is too deep for that to be the case. But there are going to be games where he's going to be the guy who drops 20. There are going to be games where he is like the lockdown defender on a key guard down the road. Nolan Hickman, because he's going to get a larger opportunity, because he's a former five-star recruit, I think we're going to see a big breakout year from Nolan Hickman. Another one, someone who's been around the league a little longer, who I think could have a breakout year, is Julian Rishway. USF is a team that's going to have to need an offensive boost from somewhere. Keep in mind with Jamari Bouye gone, that does leave kind of a lot of the a key component to that offense that is now gone. And Julian Rishwain has been consistently one of those offensive weapons over the last few years. Last year, he was one of the better players coming off the bench. He still was average. He still was averaging, not averaging, but like there were a number of games where he was the guy, the leading scorer off the bench. He had 20 against Gonzaga in the WCC tournament. Rishwain is one of the better 3-point shooters in the league. He has been a starter. He's come off the bench. He's gone back and forth. Now I think he's going to get a greater opportunity to be that guy now that he's a little bit more seasoned. He's seen kind of what it takes to get to an NCAA tournament. This team has confidence. I think that Rishwain is going to be among those guys to really kind of break out this season. It's going to be for USF. The other one is another name that's been talked about a fair amount this offseason, and that's Max Lewis at Pepperdine. Anyone who's seen the video from their international tour has seen this massive dunk from Max Lewis. He has immense physical abilities. He has talent. He was on the WCC All Freshman team last year. So maybe it's not a huge surprise that Max Lewis is potentially one of those guys that have a breakout year. But he also missed quite a bit of last year due to injury. And he never really got into a rhythm. While he had really good moments a year ago, I think this is a year where if he stays healthy and can start to get into a rhythm, we could see big things out of Max Lewis this year. I think that's where I see his progression, him being more consistent, him getting into a rhythm, him being a larger component to this Pepperdine offense and this Pepperdine team this year than he was even a year ago. So this is a guy who probably could be closer to like 15 points a game alongside Houston Mallett to really kind of just be this amazing 1-2 and this amazing 1-2 in Malibu. Two other guys I think that are going to be in the conversation. I don't know if they're going to quite raise to this level yet or how I'm kind of judging it, but the two others that stick out in my mind are going to be Brandon Pajemski at Santa Clara, who I think is a really interesting prospect. The transfer from Illinois, great 3-point shooter, was one of the more decorated high school players coming out of Wisconsin. This is a guy who could potentially come in and step right into that offensive role, that sharpshooter role for a team that's going to need it. Now they lose their top two scorers from a year ago, top three scorers actually from a year ago. And so this is going to be a key component for Santa Clara. Pajemski's going to get a chance. He's going to have the opportunity to be that guy early. And he potentially is one of the guys, again, kind of like this next tier, not quite with those top three, but I think he could be that in that conversation as we go along. Then the other one for me is Mitchell Saxon at St. Mary's. Mitchell Saxon is also stepping into a much larger role. Matthias Toss had his final season last year, and so he's gone pro. So it's going to give Saxon a huge opportunity to do more. We've already seen what he can do defensively. He's a great defender. He moves his feet well, takes up a lot of space. He's versatile, can go out on the perimeter and also defend inside. It's what can he do offensively, I think is going to be the key. Randy Bennett's offenses have almost always ran a good chunk of their offense through the center position. Look over the years, whether it be the Omar Samhans, the Brad Waldos, the Jock Landales, the Matthias Tosses, the offenses are keyed upon just on that point guard center relationship, that pick and roll offense, and even just having good passers out of the post. So Mitchell Saxon is going to have, I think, a larger role to play, much larger role to play this season. I think he is going to have a much larger role to play. And everything I've seen in the preseason, some of the film, like their trip in Australia, he looks ready. He looks like he's ready to take on that responsibility. He looks the part. I don't know if he quite raises to the same level as the first three I mentioned, but I think that we can definitely have that conversation with Saxon. Now, if you're wondering why didn't I include the Houston Mallets, the Fus Traore's, or some of these others on this list, that's because I think those types of players are already established. I don't see them as a quote breakout star because they already did break out. Julian Strother would also kind of be amongst those players where we saw it last year. We saw how good they could be a year ago. So them making the next step is not going to be a huge surprise if we see it again this season. So as we kind of get through all this, all the season previews are done. All the prognostications are starting to wrap up with the last 2 weeks of the off season coming to a close. It's getting exciting. It's really fun to see all of the teams start to really rev up. We're starting to see the Midnight Madness celebrations. We're starting to see all of the preseason accolades and everything else. And this is a fun time of year. This is one of my more favorite times of year. Like again, I'm also like a big baseball fan, so having this crossover between going from like I get to see baseball players go right into college basketball. This is one of my favorite times of year outside probably March, where it's actually the other way around, where it's March Madness goes right into the baseball season, and this is a fun time of year. I'm excited to see where these teams land. Again, like I'll do a full kind of overview of where we are next week, doing final rankings and all that sort of stuff. And it's almost here. Basketball is finally almost here. So with that, I'll get out of here. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite streaming service. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube, Unofficial WCC Hoops Podcast. Follow me on Twitter at Posts by Zach. And until next week or until next time, I will catch you later.